tuning in. This is performance psychologist Fiona Murden, and you're listening to the Dot to Dot podcast. Our purpose? To explore the rich insights that personal narratives bring, speaking to subject matter experts through to people sharing their own life stories. And while you're listening, I encourage you to find potential seeds of wisdom that could breathe new life into your current endeavours. And in the coming weeks, we'll be sharing some news about a massively exciting platform that we've spent the last year and a half developing. If you're listening after October 2023, it's already out there. But for now, sit back, relax, walk, run, drive, or do whatever you do when you're tuning in. Today, I am joined by Gurnek Bains, who I've been asking to come on my podcast for a long time. I think Gurnek, haven't I? Gurnek's a friend, also a former colleague, and a very esteemed British psychologist who's worked with some incredible people, some leaders across industry and in politics. And Gurnek and I always have a great conversation, so I'm looking forward to being able to share it with everyone today. Welcome, Gurnek.
Well, thank you, Fiona. And it's a great pleasure to be here. I know we've been planning this for some time, and let's treat this as the first one,
yes,
of conversations. So let's get into it. Yeah,
definitely. So I had to stop the conversation before because there was so much good stuff coming out that I wanted to record, and we're going to talk about today enjoying the journey. Tell me a bit more about what the focus is, Gurnek. Why are we talking about that?
We've been working in the field of sort of helping successful leaders get even better at what they do. We've been doing that for 25, 30 years. And the thing that sort of occurred to us over the years as we've been doing that work, it's very easy just to focus successful people on the goals they want to achieve, how they should go about achieving them, what are the barriers they need to tackle, etc. All of our existence almost kind of prepares us for that. And people who are successful actually just orient naturally to that. And what we found was that that's fine, but an important dimension that you forget in all that is, are these people enjoying the journey? They may be successful in getting from A to B, but have they felt on that journey? And increasingly in our coaching, we ask that question to introduce a new dimension into our coaching. And the really interesting thing is, it really takes most leaders aback. I said, oh my God, I've never been asked that, because they expect you to focus on all that. And it really pushes them into this mode of contemplation to the point where we have to say, well, let's come back to it in the next session, because I said, oh gosh, I haven't really thought of that, but it's really quite important now you mention it. It's really interesting that we can just get locked into this pattern of chasing success after success after success. And so we introduce it as a second dimension to our coaching and say it's as important as the first dimension of driving your success.
Totally. And I think you were talking about how retirees will often reflect back on life. And what were the three things that you mentioned? There were three areas.
A series of studies have shown this, and I wrote an article in Psychology Today about it. And when you ask people at the end of their working lives to look back, and you ask them, what are the main regrets or lessons or advice that you would have for others? And three things emerge typically and are really quite significantly ahead of all the other kind of regrets. One is, I wish I'd taken more risk in my life, more risk in doing what I really wanted to do, more risk in relationships, more risk in some sort of situations. Yeah. And a second is, I wish instead of just going down tram lines on autopilot, I'd ask myself, am I enjoying this journey? Am I really being satisfied here? People often found themselves in jobs or in relationships or in cities or in contexts that on reflection, they didn't really, find rewarding. And the third thing is, I wish I'd thought about the legacy I was going to leave behind. Now, when we're coaching people around success, it naturally does focus on things like legacy and the impact that you want to have in the world, et cetera, et cetera. But the first two really also play to the enjoyment point. I wish I'd thought a bit more about, was I enjoying myself? Was I being fulfilled? And I wish I'd taken a bit more risk in service, either of that, in fairness, or legacy. You know, the risk thing applies to both.
It's so interesting, and I think it also ties in with meaning. And of course, you wrote a book called Meaning Inc.
Yeah.
And there's a huge amount of research that says if we have a greater sense of meaning and purpose, which can be actually really hard to pinpoint, it's not something that, you know, people go away and go, oh, I understand what my meaning is now. But even back to, you know, Viktor Frankl, looking at people in concentration camps and saying who survived. The people that survived were the people that had a sense of meaning. And you mentioned before that part of what brings in that level of enjoyment of the journey is positive relationships.
Yes, 100%. So on that, if you're looking back on your life and you just ask people, what do they remember, or what do they have good memories about? I think there's legacy things. This is the difference I made to my kids or to others around me or to the world. You know, that people remember that. They remember high points that were really exhilarating. You know, the trip where you took a bit of risk and went to South America or the Antarctic or something. You know, they remember vivid experiences. But crucially, they also remember their key relationships. And that's just, and we lose sight of that in a way, you know, as we're leading our lives. But those are the kind of memories that people treasure. And building that bank up more consciously isn't necessarily a bad strategy to have in life.
And interestingly, that applies to everyone, because meaning doesn't have to be, I created a company that sold for X million pounds. It can be, I grew a garden that I really enjoyed, or I gave to my local community service group, or, you know, that there are ways in which I think people need to find their own sense of meaning and purpose, however big, however small. It doesn't mean you have to be running a company, basically, is what I'm saying.
100%, you know, because meaning is very much in the eyes of the beholder, and you have to get into people's worlds rather than impose your own sense of meaning on them. And there's many, many ways in which people can gain a sense of meaning and of what's important to them. And you and I have been doing this work, and it's not like just flicking a switch. It requires thought, and it requires discussion. It requires reflection. We get people to talk to people who know them well. We get them to do their lifelines. We review a whole set of other things around their motivations and their signature strengths, etc., and what gives them joy, what makes them angry, etc. You know, you have to explore all that to try and get into this whole thing of meaning, and fulfillment also naturally falls out of that. But there are some other specific things of a more tactical nature that you can also do around enjoying the journey, which I'm sure we'll get into in a few minutes.
Well, actually, I mean, and you mentioned some of those before, and some of them are quite simple, but like you said, simple but impactful. So can you explain some of those mechanisms that you were describing before?
Yeah. I would say, when we say to people, it's important for you to enjoy the journey, then after a while, people really get that. And it's a bit of a kind of light bulb moment, surprisingly, for many people. But then the next question becomes, after people have reflected on it, okay, I get it. Now, what, you know, because these are achievement-oriented people. They want tools, they want help, they want guidelines. You know, they want to attack this area with the same kind of level of insight and advice and do it well kind of thing. Yeah. And so I think for us, there are kind of sort of 3 or 4 broad areas that we would kind of sort of look at. One is the mindset with which you live your life. And I'll talk about each of these in turn. And the other are kind of habits that you build and develop on a day-to-day sort of basis. And then there's just the research on the kinds of things that you can introduce into your life that will give you sort of joy, etc. So in terms of mindset, there's a famous study that's been replicated now in a number of different environments, but it was an Australian study and it led to a project called the Resilience Project. And initially it was sparked by one of the key people involved in this project going to India. And he was looking at the Indian slums and he found that there was always a variation. Some people seemed quite joyful in that environment. Other people felt really worn down, very kind of under the weather and despondent, etc. I mean, it has shades of what Viktor Frankl was doing in the horrendous situation of the concentration camps. But anyway, so they started examining what were the factors that made for people being joyful in these conditions. And they came up with 3 things: gratitude, empathy, and mindfulness. Gratitude, they found the people who were grateful that they now had a pair of shoes versus not having them really experienced joy, versus the people who, having got those shoes, just banked it and said, well, they're a bit scruffy or they're a bit this, and we could be doing that kind of thing. So they found that people varied tremendously around their gratitude for what they had or the changes that had happened in their life. And especially in Western society, we're used to just banking what we have and thinking about the next set of goals. And what the Resilience Project suggests is just pause and ask yourself, what do you have reason to be grateful for? Because you just miss that all the time because you're all forever thinking about the next set of goals, etc.
And on that gratitude piece, I think it's so powerful. I try and think when I'm going to sleep at night, 3 things that I'm grateful for. And sometimes it can feel like, well, it's the same things as yesterday. But if you actually properly think about it, it does. It literally changes your mindset. And we know from a neuroscientific perspective as well that it redirects certain neural pathways. But it sounds so simple to just say, what are you grateful for? And it can sound a bit glib, I think.
Yeah.
But it's just so, so powerful.
And in some cultures, especially, I think, British culture, it would sound a bit American. It would sound a little bit kind of, oh, yeah, why are you doing that, right? It's just not done.
No, it's true. It's true.
And just pushing yourself to do that and just reminding yourself of what you have is really important, I think. And that was an important dimension, and one that we just constantly forget because we're always chasing,
mm-hmm.
Etc. The second thing was empathy, and this played out in various ways. They found people in the slums who were helping others had a more joyful attitude, because when you help or when you do things for people or you see somebody in need, it connects you. And one of the things we know is that relationships really are key and center stage around fulfillment and enjoyment. But empathy also had this kind of other aspect to it. What they found was that a lot of people who weren't happy were very frustrated with others around them or frustrated with other people. And the frustration was often other people aren't doing what we want them to do, or they're not behaving in a way, or they're getting in our way. And empathy allows you to put yourself in somebody else's world and see it from their perspective. And it just lowers that level of frustration with others, which is one of the main barriers to sort of relationships. Because quite often when you feel frustrated and you're not empathizing with somebody, and by the way, the retirees research shows this, one of the biggest regrets people have on the relationship side is relationships they've blown up or that went wrong and that they never picked up the phone and had a conversation. And empathy is kind of a way of sort of preventing that spiral setting in, etc. So the people who showed empathy just had better, more rounded and less frustrating relationships with people. And that was a huge component of their sense of joy in that environment.
Massively interesting as well. And in my second book, Mirror Thinking, I speak to Marco Iacoboni, who's a neuroscientist at UCLA. And he's done a wonderful interview with the Dalai Lama, talking about the neuroscience of empathy. And the Dalai Lama obviously experienced empathy from a much more spiritual perspective and a lived perspective. And I'll put the link in our show notes because it's a really interesting discussion. But I think, like you say, that empathy piece fits in with other aspects. It fits in with the relationships. It also fits in with being pro-social, which we know is not just good for the individual, it's actually good for the economy as well. There was a UN happiness report which focused mainly on pro-sociality and how it improved economic situations. So it's good for everyone, really, because it's good for the person who's feeling empathy towards someone. It's obviously good for someone on the receiving end. But it's something that we seem to have switched off almost.
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous quote by Mark Twain, which is, and we use it when we're talking about empathy, which is the best way to make yourself happy is to make someone else happy. And I mean, he intuited that, but actually research subsequently has shown that to be absolutely true.
Yeah, it's, again, another thing that's incredibly powerful, may sound simplistic in some respects, but I often find, I don't know if you find this, Gurnek, but when I'm talking to people, these people who are the successful leaders, they know how important it is to see something from someone else's perspective, but they often will forget to do it. And so it's
in
not
the hurly-burly of life, that's what you forget. And actually, that gets into the third thing, which was mindfulness. Yeah. So the idea was that, if you're mindful of your environment, you can find a lot of joy around things just around you. If you just look around you, if you may be sitting down at dinner with your family and just being mindful, oh, this is a nice event, we're connecting, as opposed to your thought whirring away about the next thing that you have to do after dinner. Mindfulness around nature, they found, was particularly kind of settling for people and gave them kind of equilibrium and emotional balance. So just connecting and communing with nature was really important. But you can go for a walk to the park, but if your mind is whirring away on something else, you won't get nearly as much benefit as if you're actually looking at the trees and the birds and hearing, etc. Just opening up the senses in that way. And it's something, I think it almost has evolutionary roots. In our hunter-gatherer days, we were probably very mindful of nature, very aware of the sounds and things around you and enjoying it, etc. We seem to have lost a lot of that connection and that touch, and it grounds us. The advice is just always catch yourself in the situation and be mindful and be present. It also helps relationships. When you're mindful, you're present in those relationships as well.
One of the things that I say there is that if you find your mind wandering when you're talking to someone, think of yourself as a detective. You're trying to find something out, and you're only going to find it out by listening in a non-judgmental way. So you're hypothesizing, you're drawing data. And it just sometimes when people are frustrated with someone or they're annoying or their mind's going, it's a way of bringing it back, just thinking, oh.
Well, that's a great practical sort of thing, just because otherwise you're not really listening. You're not really kind of tuning in. But I find just mindfulness actually also helps a gratitude thing sometimes, if you're just mindful of a situation and what's good about it, it just gives you a sense of sort of gratitude. Like, you could go to Wimbledon starting, you can go to Wimbledon, but, you could be kind of there, again, thinking about, where we're going to have lunch, where we're going to do this, as opposed to just appreciating it and just letting it wash over you and things like that. So constantly pushing yourself to be a bit more mindful, I think, kind of sort of helps guard against that.
And obviously, not obviously, but from a neuroscientific perspective, the more time we spend in a consciously mindful state, the more it strengthens the link between the prefrontal cortex of the brain and the emotional centers of the brain, which means that we're just more able to manage our emotions. And that's one thing that also helps us to feel things in a more fulfilling way. We don't get as angry, we don't get as stressed. It's kind of filling up the tank almost, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And you know what I would say, because this project was called the Resilience Project. I don't know if you experienced that, but everywhere we look these days, and I think it's a combination of economic insecurity, the impact of COVID, geopolitical events, etc. Stress levels are high everywhere. People are burdened by quite high levels of underlying anxiety, fear, stress on a day-to-day basis. And some of that is legitimate. People are struggling, et cetera, which is why some of these elements, I think, are even more important today than they've ever been, because all the studies show stress levels have been going up in most Western societies. And an underlying thing is that economically, our growth and our standard of living has actually flatlined. Whereas if you go to places like India, where the growth has been 7-8% a year, it's a different, you just feel the mood. You go there, you just feel that there's a different mood, despite the fact that it's still a much, much poorer country. It's kind of progressing. So this sort of stuff is really quite important, I think, in today's world.
And I'm also saying, with some of the leaders that I coach, they are under huge pressure because of the economic situation that we're in the UK, and then it puts a CEO under pressure, that puts their top team under pressure. The top team then spreads that to the rest of the organization, because the stress levels become contagious. So it's making the conscious effort.
There's not a single CEO. I mean, I coach a bunch of CEOs, and there's not a single CEO that I know who isn't quite stressed. Even if their businesses are doing okay, they're worried about the future, and because the world is so turbulent, etc. And that stress goes all the way through a system. And one of the things that we do in one of our programs, and we've run it with a number of companies, is we get people to draw a picture of the experience of their world currently. And those pictures always involve very high levels of stress, turbulence, angst, chaos, and people draw them, and then they sort of say, we must be, is this the worst set of drawings you've seen? And say, you know what? Everyone's doing it, regardless of sector. We're seeing these kind of drawings everywhere. And that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I didn't realize you did that. That's brilliant. I love it.
It just gets the emotional world out there right at the start, so that we can then kind of go on to, it sets the conditions for talking about, resilience, sustainability, and purpose, and other kinds of things.
Yeah, no, I think it's wonderful, because I think, you don't have the shame or embarrassment that would come of asking someone how they felt, plus the fact that people are often not able to actually recognize how they're feeling. So it's a brilliant way of doing it.
Yeah.
Something else you mentioned earlier, Gurnek, was when you're working with leaders and you started with this dimension now, or you've added this dimension in, how do you enjoy the journey? You suggested they look back at their last year. Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, sort of habits then. There's a mindset, and that will help you. And we've talked about some of the mindset things, and there's more there's more there. But there's and to your point that you were making earlier, what gives people meaning differs enormously. But what gives people joy and fulfillment also differs. And so it's a very individual thing. And one of the things we get people to do, and you can do it over a year, you can do it last week. And it's good to do macro and kind of micro. And to ask yourself, if we take the micro, what did I enjoy last week? We just take people through that. Where were the high points of enjoyment? What does that tell you about what you enjoy? And how can you do more of that and get more of that, into your life? The second question is, what did you not enjoy? What was really quite difficult, etc. Now, some things have to be done, but we can ask the question, what would doing those things in a different way, a different mindset, or in a cutting the way that you address that issue differently do? So somebody would say, I like this, this, and this, but this meeting that is a standard weekly meeting really de-energizes me, etc. So we sort of say, well, how could you engage that meeting or ask questions in that meeting or have a goals in that meeting that would kind of reframe that situation and give you something so that you came out of it feeling that you got something as opposed to you just endured something, etc. So you can do that. And through that conscious process, you're working up more of the things that you enjoy and really reminding yourself of what those are. This is in work and in your personal life. And it allows you also to manage those boundaries better because, as you know, the dial very easily switches to, just working all the time, with the biggest barrier being, this is only temporary. I'll slow down in a couple of weeks' time when I've got over this. And we find so many people just don't. You just carry on in that way. And then and then changing your approach or dropping or doing differently things that you don't find rewarding. And you can do that also over a year and look back on your life to date even. And we do that systematically in kind of those chunks, as it were.
Yeah, no, and I'm thinking if in Defining You, the first book I wrote, I guide the reader through doing that for themselves, which for people who, again, aren't necessarily leaders of organisations and want to access this sort of thing, it's there, and it's about asking the right questions of yourself and of other people, because other people will notice times that you've been incredibly happy that you may not have noticed. So I think about actually my literary agent. I remember going out with them one day and saying something, and they came back to it and they said, Fiona, you absolutely love, I can't remember what it was now, but say you absolutely love the countryside. And I'd say, well, what makes you say that? It's like, well, when you say it, your face lights up. And I think that feedback from other people is really helpful, because we don't always notice when we're at our happiest or when we're finding things most difficult.
Yeah. Others can definitely give you sort of insight into that. And just having those conversations with people who know you well and are close to you or see you on a day-to-day basis. And the other kind of sort of big kind of thing that we set, because people are kind of goal-oriented, and they quite like grids and things like that, we say, look, we will look back on this phase of your career, and it'll be the classic two-dimensional grid. Did you achieve your goals and make the progress, etc.? And did you enjoy yourself? When you're reviewing your year, typically when you're doing New Year's resolutions, you look back on your year. Quite often it'll be, did I achieve my goals? And all we say is, no, you've got to be in the top quadrant. If you achieved your goals without enjoying the journey,
what's the point?
Yeah, what's the point? What's the point? Now, I have to be honest here that there are times where people say, look, people early into some quite punishing industries in terms of time, etc., like being a lawyer in a commercial law firm or investment banking, will say, look, I know I'm not enjoying this, but it is for a period and it's to get this goal, and then I can move there. So you can consciously sort of say that, as long as you hold yourself true to that. There are times in your career and in your life when it's not always easy to always be in that top quadrant, right? And what we do, though, encourage, especially people as they get further on in life, is the enjoyment one axis actually becomes more and more and more important, because you're never going to get that time back easily again.
And that's why the saying, what youth is wasted on the young, is that the saying?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
As we get older, I think we become more, not necessarily, I think you can become old and wise, or you can become old and crotchety.
Yeah.
But if you're becoming old and wise, you have learnt to experience and enjoy things more. But obviously our bodies are going the other direction. So we need to be like Benjamin Button. But that piece of looking back at the end of life it's quite a dramatic way of looking at things, but incredibly crystallizing in terms of what that research says and what comes out of that. And
yeah, it's a fair bet that you and I be sitting down at 65, 70, looking back, and possibly, hopefully not to the same degree having those regrets, but quite likely we will as well. We will look back and think. But, it's important also to be appreciative of what you've achieved. Everything is so goal-oriented in our lives that we don't smell the roses, etc. Yeah.
I'm definitely guilty of it myself. Chris said to me, or actually he said to me quite a few times recently, look at what you've done, look at where you are. And it is very easy to say, oh, I've ticked that box, right, I'm off on to the next thing. And
yeah, you and I are exactly the same, as you know, right? I had a lot of drive. We built up a consulting firm. We sold it. I thought then it was going to be kind of, portfolio, etc. I didn't find that as meaningful, because there is that other dimension of impact that you want to have, kind of thing, which isn't to be ignored. But I have to catch myself getting into just drive mode, and people around me are quite helpful in keeping you kind of sort of anchored. So we are doing our new consulting firm in a different way, with a different rhythm, with a different set of objectives. But there's always a risk that you lapse into old patterns and start trying to build another machine, kind of thing, which I, at this stage of my career, emphatically don't want to. But I know I could easily get into that without, caution.
And I think that's massively important, the piece around people around us giving us, again, it's like people around us observing when we're happy or when we're struggling. It's giving other people permission to tap us on the shoulder and say, hang on a minute, you said that you were going to do this, and actually you've now gone off on a different tangent. Or you said you were only going to stay in investment banking until you had done X, Y, and Z deal, or for the next year and a half.
Yeah.
Hang on a minute.
Yeah,
I think
that's
you need
exactly
to think
right.
about this.
Yeah. You do need others to help you ask those questions, because otherwise, ingrained habits, you get down those tram lines, which is that other regret, the tram lines that you go down, and asking yourself, is this actually working for me? It's very easy to go down your own personal tram lines, whatever they are.
Yeah. And I advise people, when they go into a first-time CEO role, I'll always say to them, you don't need to stick with this, and you can work out how it will work for you, but put an hour in your diary on a Monday morning and an hour in your diary on a Friday afternoon, that neither of them are touched. And the Monday morning, it's to look forward and see how you would like the week to pan out. And the Friday is to reflect back.
That's a great discipline.
Think about what you've achieved, what you're grateful for, and what you've learned. Because I think That's a really interesting point, Gurnek. Where does learning come into all this? So in terms of the reward,
growth, I think. Yeah. Look, it's not in the kind of the resilience, gratitude, etc. But one of the things that gives people a sense of progression and a sense of meaning, actually, and we have a whole chapter in Meaning Inc. on this, is growing yourself. Yeah. So people can actually, it's an interesting point, cope with a lot of adversity and a lot of difficult situations, especially if they think they've grown in response to them. When we ask people, what were the most invigorating periods of their career? And this does get into the goals bit, which isn't to be sneezed at either. Remember, it's a grid. You want to be on that side of the grid and on the enjoyment side of the grid. But on the other side of that grid, when you ask people what was the high points of your career, almost invariably they will say they were times when they had a next to impossible feeling challenge, and then they kind of rose to it with others often, and achieved a good outcome. So those are the things that people remember. Also in relationships, when we ask people, when we do kind of work on relationships, to reflect on the relationships that are the strongest, quite often the pattern that we find is that they are relationships where you've worked through difficulties, you've had the honest conversation, etc. And that's grown the relationship. A challenge has grown you. That's why people feel so satisfied by those kinds of things. Yeah. So growth is an important part of not just the impact that you're having, but the impact you're having on yourself and your capabilities and on others and growth.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because growth can be seen purely as goals, but I think growth can be broken down into meaningful goals. So goals that matter rather than goals that you're trying to achieve for the sake of it. So
exactly that.
Do they align with what you really care about? But then there's also the piece around, it comes back to mindset as well, doesn't it? So have you taken learning from this situation, or have you seen it as something that's been done to you, and had a more victim mentality?
100%. Because you asked, what do you advise people when there are certain things or meetings, let's say, that they have to attend? And one of our things is, if you don't find that particularly useful meeting, or et cetera, what can you learn in it? How can you grow your knowledge of something? How can you ask certain questions? So growth is an important aspect of fulfillment, I would say. Yeah.
Interesting. And obviously, this is something I'm throwing in that we haven't discussed, but how do you see mentoring as working within this context of what we're talking about?
Well, 3 or 4 things there, kind of thing. There's a mentor and a mentee, etc. So mentoring is a great way of paying back. It's that legacy point, isn't it? It's that sense of this is the difference that I made. It also requires empathy, and actually, if you're mentoring someone, you kind of sort of also accessing all your experience and all the things. It reminds you, in a sense, might play to gratitude. This is where I've got to, and actually, I've got something to give here. So there's that. And for the person being mentored, it's growth, as you said, and it's relationship. It's growth and it's moving forward, but moving forward kind of collaboratively rather than a journey on your own.
Yes, back to that journey piece.
So I think it'd make that journey more joyful for you if there's others helping you on it, or if you're helping others on that journey. Yeah.
Interesting. And I do think that people learn a huge amount from being a mentor. They might learn about a different life context or about a different generation and how they approach 100%. Things. Yeah. But then it comes to that mindset piece as well, doesn't it? Because you could go in thinking, I'm imparting my knowledge, or you could go in thinking, I'm working, like you said, in collaboration with this person.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
actually I'm going to learn as well as helping them to learn.
100%. It connects you to someone. I mean, there's an interesting story about Freud when he was on his deathbed. Now, Freud wrote 30, 40 books, got very deep into analyzing the human condition. So as he was on his deathbed, a bunch of journalists were around him. What's your advice to sort of people, based on all your reflections, etc.? And he said, it's simple, really. And he said, Leben and Arbeit, those are the German words, right? And he said, those are the two things that really help to make you happy. And Leben is love. And he said, love connects you to people in a meaningful way. Yeah, the people around you. Arbeit is work. And he said, don't underestimate the importance of work for connecting you with your society and giving you a sense of purpose and meaning in it. And he said, if you get your work right and you get your love right and your relationships right, essentially is what he's saying. Despite all the complexity of everything that he analyzed, he said it's really that simple. And that's really interesting. That's his clue to the enjoyment axis in life.
Now, I could carry on talking to you all day, as often happens with sort of rushing off to other meetings, trying to finish conversations.
Yeah,
I do think that's a really impactful note to end on, though, with the Freudian advice.
Yeah, Leben and Arbeit. Okay, remember that. And oddly, I find it easier to remember in German because they're unusual words, so you remember them. And it's useful to remind yourself of that, because I think there is a kind of core set of truths in there that the great psychoanalyst, was the conclusion of all his reflections. So it's worth thinking about, right?
Definitely worth thinking about. And I'll go away thinking about that today. Some really, really helpful pointers for people there, I think. Really interesting for people to understand as well. And massively important. It's not just about the achieving, it's about the journey to that achievement.
Yeah. So in a year's time when we meet, the two of us should draw our grids, right? And see where we are. Right?
Yeah, it's a deal. But hopefully I'll see you before a year. But a year from today, we'll
No. But that's when we'll do that reflective thing of, where are we on this grid, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We'll hold each other to account and make sure that we do that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gurnek. I know that people are going to really, really enjoy listening to that, and I really appreciate your time.
Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you, and it's been a genuinely collaborative conversation. So it's great. Yeah, really happy to do this. And obviously we'll carry on connecting on so many things. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thanks to my guest. Thanks to you for listening. If you want to find out more about me and my work, go to fionamurden.com, or my social media handle is also Fiona Murden. If you enjoyed this, please do subscribe, review and tell your friends. It'd be a massive help. But for now, goodbye, and I hope you have a great week.